Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of Kabir Considers. In this video, I'm going to react to the history of the first Medal of Honor. Now, the Medal of Honor, I think, is the highest award you can get in the US in terms of like a military service. I think it is anyway, because the Purple Heart is below the Medal of Honor. I think, I'm pretty sure it's the number one thing you can receive. So you've got to do something just absolutely extraordinary to earn one. I know a lot of them get awarded posthumously. So people that have, died on the battlefield, they'll get one. And I think they're usually given by the president. Like, I remember watching a ceremony where family members, I think like sisters, wives, husbands, they've received it on behalf of their, dead partner, the person who did the deed. So I'm eager to find out, why the award was created, what was the thinking behind the creation of it. And I just love this sort of thing. It's going to be very, very interesting. Let's do it.
Hi, I'm the History Guy. I love history, and if you love history too, this is the channel for you. The Medal of Honor is the highest award for valor to be offered to members of the United States Armed Forces. It is so prestigious that President Harry Truman was famously quoted as saying that he would rather have won the Medal of Honor than been President of the United States.
Wow.
The medal was created in 1862, but it was possible to nominate people for actions that occurred in the past, and that meant there were actually Medals of Honor awarded for events that occurred before the Medal of Honor was created. And so it is that the earliest event for which a Medal of Honor was awarded occurred before the medal was created, and actually even before the Civil War for which the Medal of Honor was created. And it all has to do with an event that is almost forgotten and yet still extremely important to American history and still controversial today. The Medal of Honor that was awarded to Assistant Surgeon Bernard Irwin, the first chronologically by date of action Medal of Honor to be awarded, is history that deserves to be remembered.
Okay, tell us about it.
The peoples known as the Apache are a people indigenous to the southwestern United States, who are part of the Athabascan, or as it is also called, Dene language group. The language has three main groups of contiguous languages: the Northern, the Pacific Coast, and the Southern. Interestingly, the Northern and Pacific Coast groups are in Alaska, Canada, and the Northwest Pacific Coast, whereas the Southern language group, also called Apachean, which represents both the Apache and the Navajo tribal groups, covers an area from northern Mexico through Arizona, New Mexico, and into southern Colorado. It might surprise some people to find out that the language groups identify the Navajo and Apache as having diverged from peoples of the Pacific Northwest, and not from peoples of the plains to the north and east, nor from peoples who came up from Mexico from the south, as those are distinguished by having different language groups. The Apache were generally an independent people who lived in family clusters of extended family. This was important in terms of their relationships with other peoples, in that different family groups operated more or less independently, and so different bands might have different relationships with their neighbors. Although there were many cultural distinctions between groups, the Apache tended to be nomadic and made limited use of domesticated crops. Food was largely derived from hunting and gathering, as well as trade.
Wow, completely different lifestyle. Moving around, eating what you can find, what you come across. No sort of modern day farming methods. Wow.
Part of the culture was that the Apache tended to use the practice of raiding as a way of supplementing their diet. In general, the Apache distinguished raiding for economic purposes from raiding for war. They did not think of economic raiding as an act of war, and it usually occurred with small bands with specific purpose. This would become important as the Apache came into contact with European settlers, as raiding was part of the Apache traditional life, whereas settlers from Mexico and the United States tended to object to having their stock raided or stolen.
Yeah, you're going to take it. If someone just comes and takes your stuff from you, you're going to take it badly, aren't you? You're not just going to say, oh, that's their tradition, let's just let them have it. I don't think most people would respond that way.
Although Europeans often did not recognize the distinction, Apaches saw raiding for war as distinct from raiding for economic reasons. Raiding for war included larger numbers of raiders and was usually done for the purpose of retribution. And as part of that, the Apache treatment of prisoners could include brutal torture. Apache conflict with Spanish settlers began nearly as early as the two came into contact in the 16th century. The Spanish raided the Apache for slaves, and the Apache raided Spanish settlements. Moreover, Apache from the plains were being driven west by another people, the Comanche, and with less access to the bison on the plains, the Apache became more dependent upon raiding. As part of the long conflict, the Spanish built a series of fortifications along the frontier to protect from Apache raids. These were called presidios, and they eventually became the centerpieces of major modern cities like San Antonio, Texas, Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Tucson, Arizona. The conflict continued after Mexican independence in 1821, and by the mid-1830s, Mexico took to paying for Apache scalps. Punitive expeditions by the Mexicans and Anglos only intensified the conflict that cost at least thousands of lives.
Paying for scalps. Whew, man.
And left every Spanish settlement, mine, or farmstead subject to attack. Conflict with Americans started with the Mexican-American War, and after much of northern Mexico was ceded to the United States after the war, the increasing number of American settlers traveling down the Santa Fe Trail caused conflict. Promises of peace by American officials were often not respected by American settlers. Conflict between gold miners and Apaches and their Ute allies in New Mexico resulted in a conflict called the Jicarilla War between 1849 and 1854. It was amid ongoing tensions and raiding from both sides that, in January of 1861, a group of Apaches raided a farmstead in southern Arizona owned by a rancher named John Ward, taking some livestock and...
I'm guessing this is going to reach, it's going to be quite a big conflict.
Capturing Ward's 12-year-old stepson, Felix.
Oh, God.
Ward traveled to the nearby Army outpost of Fort Buchanan and complained to the fort commander, Lieutenant Colonel Pitcairn Morrison of the U.S. 7th Infantry. Morrison dispatched Company C of the 7th Infantry under 2nd Lieutenant George Bascom, a West Point graduate, to retrieve the missing boy. As they picked up the trail from the raiders, it appeared to lead towards the Chiricahua Mountains, leading Bascom to conclude that the Chiricahua Apache, whose chief was named Cochise, had been responsible for the raid. While Cochise and his people largely did their raiding in Mexico, they occasionally raided in Arizona and in fact had at least twice raided livestock from Fort Buchanan. Again, remember that raiding was a common behavior for the Apache.
Just looking at these pictures from back then, it's incredible. This is someone who lived so long ago, and we're getting to see what they look like. I don't know, I just find it incredible.
Who did not see it as an act of war. While Bascom's assumption that the Chiricahua had done the raid was understandable, it was incorrect, and that was a mistake that would prove critical.
Oh, no.
On February 3rd, Bascom and his party camped near an overland mail station, and Bascom sent a message to Cochise, asking him to come in for a talk. Cochise, along with several members of his family, came to the camp to talk. At this point, neither side was expecting a violent confrontation. Bascom demanded that Cochise return the kidnapped boy. Cochise denied knowing of the kidnapping, but offered to find the boy. Assuming that Cochise was being evasive, Bascom tried to take Cochise and his party hostage until the boy and the cattle could be returned. But Cochise managed to escape by pulling out a knife and cutting a hole in the tent in which they were eating and running away. The rest of his party, however, was taken hostage. Bascom and his 65 men returned to the overland mail station, which they fortified using wagons and grain and flour sacks. Bascom noted with dismay that more Apache seemed to be arriving, and he was besieged. While they had food, water from the spring was more than a half-mile away. Cochise managed to capture some overland mail employees and offered to trade them for his captured family members, but Bascom refused unless they returned the kidnapped boy. The problem was that Cochise did not have the boy, who had been kidnapped by a different group of Apaches. On February 7th, a group of Cochise's Apache attacked a group of Bascom's men who were taking their mules to the spring for water. One overland mail employee was killed and most of the mules were taken. Bascom came to the conclusion that he was surrounded by as many as 500 Apache and was in danger of attack, and so he decided to send out 2 scouts to sneak through the lines and seek help from Fort Buchanan. The messengers arrived at Fort Buchanan on the evening of the 8th, and Assistant Surgeon Bernard John Dowling Irwin offered to take the only troops available, 11 men
Assistant Surgeon? So this guy was a doctor?
Of Company H of the 7th Infantry to assist Bascom. On the way, Irwin and his small group encountered some Apache with stolen cattle and managed to capture 3 Apache braves and several cattle. When Irwin's party arrived at Bascom's camp on the 10th, the cattle provided much-needed beef. Irwin would later be presented the Medal of Honor for his actions, volunteering to lead the party and capturing the Apache and cattle despite having such a small force. By date of action, it is the earliest Medal of Honor to have been awarded.
Wow.
Eventually, 70 more men of the 1st Dragoons arrived as well, and the group may have been helped in that a company of the 8th Infantry, marching 15 miles away and apparently unaware of Bascom's predicament, may have been interpreted by the Apache as planning to attack their flank. Somewhere between February 14th and 16th, the Apaches slipped away, killing their prisoners and leaving them for Bascom to find. In a decision that is controversial to
just life back then just must have been so brutal. killing must have been way more commonplace, you know, just happening all the time. Not that it doesn't happen now, but probably to a much higher degree.
To this day, the American officers decided to execute their hostages, the 3 braves that Irwin had captured and the 3 that Bascom had taken, although they did release the women and children from Cochise's party. This turned out to be a grave error, as the 3 Apache that Bascom had captured were Cochise's brother and nephews. The decision to execute those men turned the Apache anger from Mexico to the United States and sparked the Apache Wars, which would last for more than 2 decades and cost thousands of lives.
Oh my God.
One of the most controversial aspects of the so-called Bascom affair was how much Lieutenant Bascom had to do with the decision to execute the Apache prisoners. Bascom is usually presented as the villain whose miscalculation started a bloody war, but actually of the 4 officers that were there, 2 from the 1st Dragoons, Assistant Surgeon Irwin, and Bascom, Bascom was the junior of the 4, and records discovered since suggest that he was the only one of the 4 to raise objections to the execution. In fact, the order for the execution seems to have come from Assistant Surgeon Irwin. The records from the Bascom affair have largely been lost, as Fort Buchanan was abandoned at the start of the Civil War and Bascom's original report was apparently destroyed. George Bascom himself died leading a company of the 7th Infantry in the Battle of Val Verde in February of 1862, part of the far western theater of the U.S. Civil War. Assistant Surgeon Irwin served throughout the Civil War and eventually achieved the rank of colonel before retiring. He received the Medal of Honor for actions that occurred in February of 1861, 33 years later, in 1894, shortly before his retirement. Cochise turned out to be one of the Army's most skilled adversaries, but eventually he did agree to live peacefully on a reservation, and he died of natural causes in 1874. One of the most surprising turns in the Bascom affair has to do with the captured boy, Felix Ward. Long thought to have been killed, it turns out that he had been captured by a group of Pima Apache, with whom Cochise was unrelated, and raised by them. He later served with the U.S. Army as an Apache scout, using the name Mickey Fee. The Bascom affair was one of many examples where inexperienced officers on the frontier made missteps that resulted in conflict. And that nearly forgotten event on the border between the United States and Mexico in February of 1861, which sparked the bloody Apache Wars, which actually continued clear into the 20th century, is a good example of what can happen when there is a clash of cultures, and possibly the inevitable result of American westward expansion. It is history that deserves to be remembered.
Absolutely.
I'm the History Guy, and I hope you enjoyed this edition of my...
For me, the last point he made, or one of the last points, the one where he basically said, you know, a lot of conflict is just the result of a clash of cultures. You know, it seemed that the Apaches and other Native American groups had, you know, that tradition of raiding just for economic reasons. You know, they did it to each other, and I guess there was an understanding when it happened. But you know, for the European settlers who came, you know, and fairly understandably, if somebody comes and takes all of your food and all of your like livestock and crops and stuff like that, you're going to be pretty annoyed by that. And you know, you're not going to just let that go. You're going to try and investigate, find the people responsible, etc., etc. Really, really interesting. It's kind of sad, really, that one guy's actions kind of resulted in the starting of that decades-long war. But the guy was inexperienced. You know, he had to make a decision. It wasn't the right one, but he had to make a decision. Obviously, if we could go back in time, maybe things would have been done differently. But yeah, really, really, really fascinating story. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.